You did always say that I was going places, and that you wouldn't have it any other way.
I'm Rania Hafiz. I live in Woolwich, overlooking the beautiful Thames. I was born in Beirut, in Lebanon, and from the age of 9 months I've been traveling. Soon after I was born, my father went to work in the UAE, United Arab Emirates, except at the time they were not the United Arab Emirates. They were still separate little towns, really. And he went to work there. He was a businessman and a contractor. And when I was 9 months old, I followed him with my mother. So ever since I was 9 months, I've been taking airplanes like other people take taxis. We lived in different little towns in the UAE. We lived in Al Ain, which is an oasis. And we lived in a very basic, kind of, not the mud hut, not a mud house, but something very similar, which had a lot of sand and palm trees. And the UAE, Dubai, wasn't what it is now. It was still sand and camels and very basic. And my mother, she decided the best thing for me was to be sent home to Lebanon to school. And being sent home to Lebanon meant I had to go to boarding school. The boarding school was a Catholic convent. Lebanon at the time, although I was very sad to be in boarding school, but actually Lebanon compared to the UAE was they called it the Europe of the East. And Beirut used to be called the Paris of the East. It was highly developed. It was great fun. We saw ourselves as more Westerners than Easterners, really, because my uncles were all not married. So they had quite a vibrant social life, and they used to take me along with them to when they went swimming. So there were loads of beach clubs, fishing. They would take me fishing with their friends on boats. And also where my grandmother's house was in the heart of Beirut. And the university, the American University of Beirut, was just up the road. So loads of students always coming and going. Really a vibrant life. And the one thing that comes to my mind is how glamorous all the women were, particularly my aunt, my mother when she used to come and visit, even my grandmother, my great aunt. So I remember women being very, very glamorous, very chic, really. They were always at hairdressers, they were always getting together, and when I was home, the women would get together and smoke what we call argili, which everyone calls a shisha here. So this was a really, really interesting time. And at the time, Lebanon would have been the only democratic country in the Middle East, in that we had elections and we had a constitution. But there was still a lot of sectarian problems that were under the surface. And I suppose my experience of them would have been when I was 7 years old at school. And again, being in a Catholic convent school. And the teacher asking us about, for some reason, to name, obviously it was a girls' school, to name an uncle. And she was going through the class, and every girl would say the name of an uncle. And this might be confusing, but unless people understand sectarianism, all the Lebanese are Arabs and they speak Arabic. Some names tend to be more likely to be Christian, and others more likely to be Muslim. And I have many uncles. Most of them have names that could be interchangeable. But I don't know why, the only name I could remember, the only name that came to mind, and I blurted it out, was the only name that would be distinctly Muslim. And I was only 7. So as soon as I said that name, the whole class burst out laughing. So you can tell even 7-year-old girls, they could even replicate the tension, and I burst out crying. And the brilliant thing is that my teacher actually sent me out of the class, which seemed to everybody like she was punishing me. But she soon followed me, looked at me and said, "Why are you crying? Why are you giving them the satisfaction? Wipe your tears. Go back in there. You said nothing wrong. You should be proud." And that was one of the best lessons I ever learned. Well, when the Civil War broke out, I remember that day very clearly because I was waiting for the school bus with my brother. And someone came around and said, "Go back home, there are no school today." And the roads were particularly quiet. And Beirut is a very busy city. And I remember going back and later on hearing some shots being fired, which was quite a shock. And then we were on a plane and we were back in the UAE. I wasn't sad to be back in the UAE. I always loved the United Arab Emirates. We were by the time living in Abu Dhabi. And by then it had developed so much within 6 years of me leaving it as a child. I mean, I used to go back and forth, but every time I went there was something new. And in a way, my father was part of that development because he was a building contractor. So it was great to go around and seeing the different buildings my father contributed to building. When I was growing up, when I was in boarding school, people had a faith, but some people practiced, didn't. They mixed, they intermarried. People were quite progressive. Nobody, the only women I knew who covered up were the nuns. I knew no other women. Even my grandma used to wear a tiny little headscarf like the Queen does when she goes riding, and only when she was out for a while then she would take it off. So having grown up in this quite liberal society, very slowly I could see, as although there was a war, we used to come back and visit anyway. And after 2 years, I did go back to school in Lebanon. And I remember for the first time seeing our neighbours. And there were 3 young women who lived in a building opposite us. I didn't know them, but they were wearing headscarves. And I'd never seen, beside my grandma's little sharp, I used to call it, or my great aunt's little white headscarf. I had never seen, and the nuns, I had never seen young women wearing headscarves. So obviously religion was starting to play a different part in Lebanon. But then the war carried on for 18 years. There was a period of about 9 months where Lebanon was very quiet and everybody thought the war was over. It was after the first 2 years of the war. But unfortunately, by Easter, Israel had invaded and started bombing Beirut, and I was at school when the bombing started. And we could see it. We could see it over the coastal road when the Israeli airplanes were bombing the coastal road. So that was quite terrifying. After that, I never went back to school there. I did go back for 1 year to Lebanon, and we all thought the war was over. We all thought the war was an aberration, that Muslims and Christians had lived together for a long time in peace. This has nothing to do with religion. I think we were right. It was nothing to do with religion, but there were much stronger forces taking part. I think a lot of the forces were about the relation with the West, or the relation with politics, whether people are supporting, at the time, the USSR, whether people wanted a kind of a socialist government across the Arab world. And a lot of people felt that Lebanon was reflecting the tensions in the Middle East. So the tensions around Palestine, the Palestine-Israel situation, playing proxy politics or war for other bigger matters. With the invasion of Israel, specifically to put down, at the time, the PLO, I came with my parents to spend the summer in England. We actually couldn't go back because the Israeli invasion actually brought out loads of different militias, and the war resumed again. But this time the war resumed with a vengeance. But also there were new forces were being created. What happened is, with Israel coming into the south, we have to understand Lebanon geographically is quite sectarian. So where my grandmother lived, where my mother comes from in Beirut, it's very mixed, Muslims and Christians. Now the 2-year war meant that some areas, some Muslims went to one area, Christians to another area, and there was one famous green line, which was literally a road, where one side was Sunni Islam and the other side was Christian. And there was a lot of fighting across the green line. And it's funny because it's not a green line, it's actually just an area, and it was an area of beautiful hotels, very well known, Riviera of the East. And until now, to remind everybody, a couple of the hotels are still there with all the bomb damage, so people can remember what was going on. And people were literally fighting with bombs and missiles one road to another. So that was Beirut. But the south of Lebanon was largely Shia. And the Shia were very poor, really. They were more kind of peasants or farmers, but poor farmers, living on subsistence, really. But with Israel coming in and then staying in the south, that kind of politicized the Shia of the south. And although there'd been a secular Shia party called Amal, that was the beginning of what we now have as Hezbollah. The secular nature of the country was giving way to a sectarianism that became more religious in terms of identity. And the politics were the politics of resistance, but there were other things at play. And I think one of the biggest thing in the region that really played a big part was the Iranian Revolution. Because the Iranian Revolution had massive impact on Lebanon, because suddenly a dispossessed group of poor people, Lebanese Shia, who had been really downtrodden essentially and economically unable to realize ambitions and lived really as the kind of the poor relatives, now had more political support when people say as bad as Beirut, Beirut was getting really bad. There was hardly any building that escaped missiles or gunfire. People were being kidnapped, depending on their sect. So there'd be roadblocks up, and Christians were kidnapping Muslims. It was really, really bad. On top of all that, there was also kind of routine Israeli bombing, which kind of added. But by then, the Syrian army had come in, essentially to start with, to support one particular group, the Phalangists, but then went against them, started supporting other groups. So Lebanon became almost a playground of different militias and different political forces, really. And I didn't come here originally because I was escaping the war, not at all. The summer when I was 14, we were expecting to go to Austria for our summer, and I got a call from my mother, and I said, "So, have we booked our villa in Tyrol?" She said, No, we decided we won't go to Austria, we're going to go to England instead. And I actually burst into tears because my idea of England was grey and miserable, and I didn't really want to come to England. And I'd known other people who went, and it just seemed so passé, really. Everyone was going to England. Why would I want to go there? We spent 2 months in Brighton and 1 month in London, which I found absolutely dull and boring, really. My school, Shweifat, was a co-educational school. I think currently it's very few schools have now are co-educational in the Gulf. Things have changed. I wouldn't say gone backwards, but that kind of progressive liberal reality that existed seems to have taken a step back. And women and men, again, there is sexism, and I'm not going to deny it. There will be some, but it's not. It'd be terrible to say benign sexism, and I can see feminists all over the world screaming at me. There is no such thing as benign sexism, but I suppose it was couched in terms of looking after the women. So although we had, as a teenager. My aspirations in terms of education or achievement were limitless, but I suppose it didn't apply to everybody. It did come from the fact that I did have quite a privileged background. At 18, I suppose I bucked the trend. And the trend wasn't women staying at home and getting married and having children. The trend was we're going to finish school. I took an international baccalaureate. We're going to go abroad. All my friends went to the States or Europe to study. But what happened is I fell in love and got married. And that was the reason why I came to England, because the man I fell in love with was English. And again, for a Lebanese woman, an Arab woman, to marry somebody who was not a Lebanese to start with, not an Arab, but especially not Lebanese, was quite revolutionary. And I think credit to my parents who let me have my way. Lebanon has changed drastically, and not for the better. The war may be over, but because, again, the religiosity came back because of the civil war, a lot of the social conventions became even stricter. So you can go to Beirut and you can see women with bare midriffs and, beautiful, beautiful, beautiful women, stunning women. And you think, wow, they are completely liberated, they're living the life, it's wonderful. But actually, their main concern, besides maybe getting their degree, is getting a husband. Because whatever your religion is, it's still a very Arabic country, and increasingly security for a woman relies on having a family unit. My husband was half English, half Malay, so it was very interesting because I was marrying somebody who was a Muslim, who had the same faith as myself, but obviously had been brought up in a completely different culture. So because I spoke English fluently, I'd been to international school, I kind of thought there would be no issues. I would be fine, I've been to England before. We didn't see ourselves as bounded by national identities or national boundaries. We had studied, we had kind of international literature, we had studied science to the highest level. I think we saw ourselves as citizens of the world. So coming to England didn't hold any fears for me. Having said that, when I actually did come and it settled, I realised it wasn't going to be as easy as I thought. And also I had no idea about things like visas, and because we'd travelled before, and obviously my father had taken care of everything. And I suppose really when you're wealthy, it is much easier to travel around the world. It's only when you come from a country which is maybe seen as harbouring terrorists, or maybe you are seen as an economic migrant. this is when you start, things become very difficult for you. And at the time, I had no idea. I kind of presumed you just got on an airplane and went anywhere in the world. To start with, because I was going to go to university, and my then husband was also going to carry on with his studies. He was doing a master's. We actually lived on campus at his university, which is Cranfield. It was in the middle of nowhere in Bedfordshire, and the fact that people had laundrettes, I couldn't understand how people didn't have their own washing machines. So you can imagine that people would think, oh well, they presume that because I came from the Middle East, it was backwards. But to me, life in England was really backwards, because simply, as students as well, we couldn't afford what I had taken for granted before. So I remember being students and living in student digs, albeit on campus. I had to go to the laundrette a couple of times, and I hated it so much that for my birthday I asked my husband, when he said, "What do you want?" I said, washer dryer, please. Currently, my son is living and working in Kuwait. His wife is Canadian, of Pakistani origin. My middle daughter is volunteering in Palestine, and my youngest daughter is about to go and volunteer in South Africa. And when you talk to them, I ask them how they define themselves, and I think they say they are a mixture of everything, and they're very happy to call on to whatever heritage they have. But I suppose they're really Londoners above all. As for me, I think over the years I've defined myself in different ways. There was a time when I would be because since coming to England, I became more religious and I started wearing the hijab. So obviously I very clearly am a Muslim, or I am the other. Although now there's so many women like me, you just trip over us when you're walking out and about. But for a while, people would say to me when I would be introduced, when I was a school governor or started to work, "Where are you from?" And I always resented that question because it always assumed I didn't belong here. So I used to say Catford, because that's where my house was, and that shut them up straight away. But over the years, I've kind of realised that, it doesn't have to be. I'm not far. I don't mind now when people do ask me. And I suppose in my old age, I've kind of wanted to reclaim my Lebanese, not heritage, but kind of the Lebanese aspects of myself. So I kind of end up now, I cook more Lebanese food than I used to before. And I do say I'm from Lebanon. Although when I went recently to visit my family in Lebanon, even walking into shops, people in Lebanon would say to me, "Where are you from?" I said, "What do you mean? I'm Lebanese like you." And they say, "No, you've been out. You haven't been living here." And I suppose that they can tell, they can tell me from a mile away that actually I've been an expatriate. I'm the diaspora, the Lebanese diaspora. And somebody once said, actually my brother, his wife is half English and half Malay. And when they first got engaged, I asked her, I said, what do you feel more? Do you feel more English or more Malay? And she looked at me and she said, "Rania, with the English I feel Malay, and with the Malays I feel English." But I don't have that problem actually. I suppose I'm a Lebanese Londoner, or a Londoner Lebanese. Sometimes I'm British, sometimes I'm English. I go to the UAE a lot. I go to Kuwait where my son is. I go to Lebanon to visit family. I have family in the States. I have family in Germany. So at the end of the day, I suppose back to my teenage times, I still feel like a citizen of the world, really. And I think long may it be that maybe it becomes easier for people to move around like it was. Because when I was young, I thought nothing of getting on an airplane. It is great now that you can get cheap flights, different places, hopefully, not just for holiday. The worst part is the visa restrictions. I am lucky in that I do have a British passport. It's much easier for British people to get around the world. It is much more difficult for other people. It's still, people think that it's the economic migrants who come here. Actually, those who make it to Britain tend to be quite well off back home because they've worked out how to get here. It is still very difficult to move around. And I just wish that more people get the chance to really have, be citizens of the world and have that free movement, because it just enriches all our lives.
You did always say that I was going places, and that you wouldn't have it any other way.